Honour to introduce our next presenter, who I'm sure is, I don't know if you've missed any AWRC. Dr. Anne Fowler graduated from the University of Sydney with a veterinary science degree after completing a Bachelor of Science honours year investigating vitamin D metabolism in nocturnal marsupials. Further qualifications obtained include membership in the Australian and New Zealand College of Veterinary Scientists in the following fields: avian health, medicine of Australian wildlife, and the medicine and surgery of unusual pets. Dr. Fowler has worked in mixed practice in New South Wales and Victoria. She has been employed as a senior clinical registrar at the Wildlife Health and Conservation Centre at the University of Sydney and as an associate veterinarian at the Australian Wildlife Health Centre at Healesville Sanctuary. In 2016, Anne opened the Adelaide Bird and Exotics Vet Centre, which was Adelaide's first birds and exotics only vet clinic. Patients seen include birds, reptiles, small marsupials, mammals, and wildlife. Besides working as a veterinarian, Dr. Fowler has been teaching wildlife carers throughout Australia for 14 years on topics related to wildlife care. She also created a training day on the assessment and treatment of burnt wildlife, and since 2006 has educated over 1,400 people to assist burnt animals in Australia. She has also been a licensed carer wherever she has lived. Dr. Fowler firmly believes that sharing information leads to informed and empowered wildlife rehabilitators and better outcomes for the welfare of Australia's unique wildlife.
Oh, that's even better. Would you like how I put the organisers put the refeeding syndrome just before morning tea? So I will be expecting you to eat sensibly and also rehydrate. Okay, we're going to start with this. Why am I talking to you about this? And I actually want to start maybe with an apology, because I think talking about weights is a trigger. I think you all look beautiful. I don't care how big, small, ugly or beautiful you are. We're here to talk about wildlife and wildlife that comes in. My first question to you is, who here has actually rescued or seen a thin animal? Have we talked about it though? You don't really have a game plan, do you? That's what today's about. How many here use body condition scoring? Suddenly only half the room. That's why we need to talk about it. So we've got wildlife essentially coming into care, and they're starving for a variable period of time, aren't they? It might be essentially the owl that got knocked by a car at 10 o'clock at night and missed out on eating the mouse. It might be the joey who's been stuck in a pouch for 48 hours before the member of the public picks it up. It could be, of course, the seabird. It could be the reptile that finally gets found. So what's often not appreciated, because at the end of the day, we're feeders, is that these animals are also dehydrated, and a dehydration protocol has to sit very firmly in our rehabilitation plan and our feeding plan for these animals. And of course, yeah, we want to feed it. We're just so many of us. I mean, my clinic's based essentially in a Greek community. I got a lot of feeders. I got a lot of nonnas out there. So love them dearly, but it's got to be paced, hasn't it? And that is one of the key messages for today. So I really don't want to focus on refeeding as it's described very much in humans, where there is almost this intense demand to keep on sucking people's blood to work out where their electrolytes sit. I think that even as Michelle was talking about this morning, that we've got a lot of on the ground, what can you do with your hands? Not all of you are going to have a fancy iStat. And although she is saying that the cost of iStats are going down, and that shows me electrolytes, for example, the cost per cartridge is still $25. Truly, in a refeeding syndrome situation, I'd want to do that 4 times in 24 hours. Suddenly, I've just blown your budget, haven't I? We're going to use your eyes. We're going to use your hands. That's what we're going to do. And of course, how often have you had these emaciated animals that come in and you do your absolute utmost and they die a few days later, and of course, you blame yourself, don't you? Rather than stepping back and going, you know what, we did a great try, but maybe this animal's body was broke before it began from the simple act of starving. And then that helps you to influence the decision. That why I'm doing this is that in the last 5 years or so, as I did do some teaching, euthanasia on the grounds of emaciation seems to be quite unpalatable, and yet it is a rational decision. So why are these animals starving? And I think this is the question. I literally pick them up and shake their little heads and say, why are you here? Well, I don't quite, because, shaker syndrome's not a nice thing either. So migration. Well, yes, we'll talk about that in a few moments with our shearwaters who are on their way, aren't they? How about failure to learn to hunt? There's another. Our boom-bust cycles, and we've just had the mouse plague through New South Wales, and we're about to lose so many animals as a consequence of hopefully getting on control of that. They've done their job. And of course, chronic disease as well. Let's look at some examples. Just a long way to go, our short-tailed shearwaters. And, again, I suppose if you're going to decide to leave the Arctic and go for a bit of a jaunt across the planet, of course you're going to hit some trouble along the way. I don't know how many of you are ABC nerds like we are in our family. We're the right demographic, the ABC, over 50, educated. Okay, I'm kind of stuck with what I can watch. I can't seem to turn to Channel 10. So there has been a great show just recently just popped up and actually looked at some of the issues for the migrating seabirds. They were looking at curlew sandpipers, the knots, and I can't remember if it was the curlew or the whimbrel. Same but different. And they were talking about, I think it was the whimbrel, that literally she just hit a tropical cyclone and had to shift 2,000 kilometres or 1,000 kilometres or more, essentially west of her normal flight path. That costs money, that costs time, that costs nutrition. So when she lands, is she going to be okay or not? These guys, and then again, as you go to morning tea, and no doubt some of you are already hungry, the coffee stand's been working all morning. How many of these guys are just literally leaving without sufficient resources? And that may be climate change based. We're seeing so many of ours on our eastern flyway, for example, where China is, of course, removing the mud flats because that's going to make land for factories, which we will all benefit from. But those are the feeding grounds for these animals, and they're setting off with less resources. And they saw that, I think, with I think it was the knots, that their beaks are getting shorter. The food that they're trying to find, they can't access anymore. They have to eat another food that's less energy dense. Are we going to see more issues? Yes, we are. And of course, when we see them stranding on our beach, it is pretty tough to appreciate that you are only looking at less than 1% of the population. Well, I'm going to argue that could be considered acceptable wastage. But some you'll get back. What about emaciation? Because you failed to learn to hunt, you just don't grow up and leave home. Yes, it's not just a problem for little penguin, but here's the study, interestingly based in WA, that up to 30% of the deaths in the little penguin are just simply because youngsters just don't learn to hunt fish. And you kind of go, guys, this is hardwired. What's wrong with you? But again, this is essentially what the population is meant to be doing, and they're not. Interestingly, we've had some other events which did impact on penguin and some of the other birds, and they were the pilchards die-offs from herpes virus in sort of late past of last century. Don't you love saying that? So again, we saw increases in deaths and presentations associated with those die-offs. And then, yes, we've just had the boom. Now it's time for the bust. What do we do with all of these excess predators? And they're often the youngsters who didn't really learn to do this well. There was just so much food around, you just kind of picked it up. But if you haven't refined those hunting skills in that time, then you are presenting emaciated. And barn owls are such a classic example of this. For me, I remember this happening back when I was in Victoria, so I'm going to say late 90s, and there were so many barn owls, young barn owls coming into care, that the government agency made the decision to permit translocation back out to kind of spread the jam again, because they were just landing in areas where there were just too many and not enough mice. And then the chronic illnesses. And I think this is the more insidious ones in situ. These aren't the big events. This is, it's going to happen today. It's going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen next week. Death by 1,000 cuts across a whole range of species. So I've given examples here. So spironucleosis in our Australian king parrots, essentially, and of course, avian gastric yeast. Massive reason for emaciation that I see in rainbow lorikeets in my state, but I'm trained to look for avian gastric yeast, and not many vets are. So we know it's a killer. If you've got a rainbow lorikeet in the 80 grams, it's got AGY. It's in serious trouble. It should be 110 plus. And of course, our galahs, that's that top image there, again, with avian gastric yeast, that we see our May die-offs of these young birds who've not managed to deal with this normal participant in their gut flora. I've got exudative dermatitis in brushies. If you notice, as they get up and get bad, you start going, this thing's just a bag of bones, isn't it? And that is because it costs the body to fight infection. The other one up there for birds I didn't include was aspergillosis. So that's another one of the biggies that will just chronically chip away at your weight until you hit the point where you have nothing left to do. And of course, then what about us in rehabilitation? Well, and this is one of the core reasons I did want to talk about this, because I was reflecting that around this sort of time thinking, God, what am I going to talk about? Was remembering that when I went and did training in one group, that every animal they put on the table for their bring out the dead afternoon handling and participation, sort of what's wrong with this animal, every single one of them was starved, was underweight. And the philosophy in that rehabilitation group, and this was for birds, was that no bird got fed for 24 hours. And yet the same group said, well, if you don't feed that kangaroo Joey within 6 hours, you are a person full of evil. Animals are animals. Let's not differentiate. Let's not be speciesist. And once we kind of got that fixed, when I went back a couple of years later, all of the animals that were dead were in good condition, which was good. So let's think also about it is, are you presenting food correctly? What if you've got a hunter and it's just sitting there as a blob? You know, we keep looking at some of the raptors we deal with and offering them white mice, and they go, they're not white in the wild, Anne, are they? You know, and there's a piebald one. Whew, never seen that colour variation before. It's a little bit like me colouring your lunch blue today. There's nothing wrong with the colour blue. It's just you don't think that mashed potatoes should be blue. So narrow-minded of you. Maybe it's not the correct prey item. So we see this again. I was thinking of birds of prey back for that as such a great example, is that I'll give a plug for the bird rehab book that you can pick up for free from Wambaroo today, is that it really took me some years to grasp that some birds of prey want to eat birds and some want to eat mammals. Because the tradition is just, you're just going to give everyone mice. You give a peregrine falcon a mouse and it goes, and what do you call that? You know, you give it something with feathers and it says, oh yeah, it's got it. But isn't it even the same that as we kind of look at things like, why would you put a piece of sweet potato in front of an animal that eats grass? Nope, doesn't make sense to me either. May not make sense to them. Maybe we're not assist feeding. Maybe we haven't taught our young people who are coming into this that these animals need to be on a feed plan, that if there is a time point at which they haven't eaten, they have to be given food. And I'm expecting that essentially a tawny frogmouth, a kookaburra, small raptors that you would deal with all need assist feeding. So would the baby possum. And you have no problems with putting a teat in its mouth and assist feeding it, do you? And yet you'll have a tawny frogmouth and you go, wonder when I start to give food to it. Nope, same plan. Let's get on with it. Let's not create a starvation syndrome in care. The food's not weighed in and out. That was a bit of a absolute game changer, or a bit of a absolute mind sort of moment for one particular carer whom had, in this case, a falcon, peregrine falcon. She wasn't measuring the food in. She didn't measure it out. The bird was emaciated when I saw it 10 days later. It was dying from refeeding syndrome, or it was going to head into that as we started to refeed it. Never had been thought to do that. And of course, never weighed a mouse. Well, every mouse is different. It's an individual. And like all of us here today, if we could find two people with exactly the same weight, I'd be amazed. Our food needs to be measured going in and going out. Did this animal actually eat it? Do you have in your systems what we call the pie chart of food consumed, where it's a quarter, half, most, all? And that's documented each day, because either you are feeding too much, go back and check the book, or you're underfeeding. And the magic rule of thumb that we've had for so long, that feed 10% of body weight, okay, fine place to start, not going to be accurate. Not accurate realistically across any species. So we've got so often, as we think about this, our refeeding syndrome is going to be in things like, I actually think of things like very small passerines. how often is it that the pardalote, the wren, the New Holland honeyeater, all of these 10 grammers die in care because the rule is you feed them 3 times a day. And yet you have a 50-gram brushtail or ringtail possum or whatever, and you will feed it 8 times a day. Why aren't you feeding it 3 times a day? It's what you're doing to the other small animals of a similar size. Got to understand that some of these guys, and can you imagine if I tasked you with feeding 30% of your body weight today? Okay, we just don't do it as a species, so it's hard for us to get into the mindset that other animals just are energy junkies and they can just shovel the food in and need to do so to stay alive. We almost kind of grasp that for hummingbirds, but we don't grasp it for our small honey eaters, do we? So yes, change your thoughts about what we do. The smaller you are, the more you're going to get fed. And of course, it's not just a bird problem. I keep realizing that this is a focus as I talk about this, because something like the shearwater is such a classic example that most people on the East Coast have met. But yes, I keep seeing emaciated reptiles coming in. I'm seeing a coastal bearded dragon in Adelaide, and we'll get 1 to 2 a year that are skin and bone. Now, I still think we're sitting at the bottom of some sort of disease process, or are they really just in the wrong location? Are we on the edge, and we are, of a distribution? So therefore, as they keep pushing out, they'll meet circumstances and environments that are not sufficient, and that restricts your distribution on a map. Or is it, of course, something like our wombats with mange? We see emaciated kangaroos that are put behind fences. Think of defence facilities, for example, where they're quite secure. We have so many circumstances across so many species where we will see emaciation, this amount of weight loss. So emaciation, almost by definition, and I'll come to this in a moment as we get back to the body condition scoring, is really talking about you are more than, you're at 30% underweight. And I like to bring that back to even 20% underweight. But what I do want to open up the idea as we talk of the ideas of emaciation is that the first one, stage 1, is essentially going to happen to every single animal that you rescue today. It didn't get fed today. It got hit by a car. It lost its mother and thus its milk. It did finally land on a shore. And essentially, if you like, it's just lacking its food inside its stomach. That's stage 1. So realistically, every animal needs to be fed, don't they? They've been outside their envelope, and we have essentially lost that ready-to-go store that essentially sits inside our stomach. Our stage 2 is loss of body fat. So often this is something I'm starting to appreciate as I get to a post-mortem stage, or a little difficult to appreciate, but this is going to be an animal who's maybe just lost 5, 10 to 15% of body weight. So it started to use some of what it already has inside it. Our trouble becomes is, what about those animals that don't have a lot of reserve? And so, so many of our young animals don't have a lot of body fat and don't have a lot of fat that they can use as such. And of course, our small birds are just go, 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 go. It's that literally race every day to stay alive. If we think about it, birds lose 1% of their body weight each night. Can you imagine going to bed and losing 1% of your body weight? As I like to say, if you wanted to look good for the dress in a week's time, you'd just go to bed for a week and you'd go, I've lost my weight, I'm ready for the logies, yes? Now that just makes it a continual battle to stay alive, doesn't it? And makes the importance of getting food into those very small birds quite important. The stage really, if you like, where we're going to start to see a refeeding syndrome is at stage 3. Where we've lost muscle mass as well as fat. We have an empty gut. We have ticked 3 boxes. We've affected 3 different organs, if you like. I think that it is uncommon, but again, it's worth talking about. We want to find these individuals amongst all that we do end up seeing and try to understand, is it a migration? Is it a chronic disease that we won't win against? Is it just failure to learn to hunt, always the tough one? What's going on? So body condition scoring is really trying to assess that 3rd stage, that loss of muscle mass, okay? Now, our challenge is, in so many ways, is that not everyone is the 5 of the peregrine falcon. when we start to see birds that fortunately do come in uncommonly, so our rails, for example, if you're designed to walk through reeds, it makes no sense to be wide, you have to be quite narrow, and they start at a 2. So there are some species variations, but I still feel that this is a valuable tool that is literally the first thing I do when I pick up an animal to examine it. What kind of condition are you in? Because suddenly the picture, for me, the algorithm of what I'm going to do next starts to flip on, are you in good condition or are you heading to emaciation? What have I got to go and look for at that point? If you're in good condition, as I like to say, you've just had one bad day. You've just been hit by the car or your mum has. But you come to me emaciated and you've had many bad days. And therefore I'm behind the 8 ball when it comes to trying to fix your problem. And that, again, changes my rehabilitation plan for the critter. Let's go and have a look. Of course, in Australia, there is no way we could have consensus, is there? And so the platypus people felt very much out by themselves and obviously hadn't read a textbook with any other kind of body condition scoring, and they flipped it. So instead of, 1, small number, poor condition, 5, lots of numbers, big condition, a platypus in 5 is this guy here, and he's emaciated. He's lost all of the fat in his tail, and you can bend his tail end to end. Wouldn't it be nice if it was consistent? But it's not. And that's what keeps us guessing. And of course, many of you are going to go, yeah, Anne, it's okay, irrelevant. I'm not going to feel the condition score on a platypus in my lifetime. I thought that too until I went to Hillsville Sanctuary, yes. So in birds, we're looking over the keel, so that breastbone, if you like to think, you're going to go and see a condition score. It's sitting in coals. It's the chicken we're going to have as a roast. Kangaroos and possums over the tail. Why? Again, we've got to understand where it comes from, because of course, what was the bit the researchers were putting in the Hessian sac or feeling? The tail. So it's a logical thing to feel, and it's a restraint bit. So you're actually getting a body condition score as you hold the animal. Remember, they were catching big ones, not little ones. Our wombats, dassies and lizards, we're kind of looking over the pelvis area. We're looking for muscles essentially over the top of the hip bones. And again, is this sort of like validated? I'd say it probably isn't for lizards, but it's such a great place to do this. It is something that can be used and is easily done on a visual. Koalas' shoulder blades, yes, had to be different, didn't they? And again, this is actually about what they do is they climb, yes? So the bit that we want to assess the condition on is how good are you at climbing? Does make sense when you think of it that way. Snakes, essentially muscles either side of the spine. We're not going to find a shoulder blade or a pelvis on those guys. And turtles, again, not validated, but would appear to be a logical thing, is it's actually about their chewing muscles. So if they've got good chewing muscles, then they are able to eat. And this appears to be something that, again, is easily assessed. So I look at both wild and pet turtles. I just have to write paper now, don't I? Oh, okay. And of course, the other thing I'm after, and I was so hoping that my, little packet of calipers would arrive for this from China, but they didn't, is again, the encouragement I'd make. The big thing that it seems that most groups aren't doing is collecting a skeletal measurement. I've got you weighing, tick the box, fabulous. Now we need to start measuring heads or legs, some part of the animal. What we need to understand is, yes, okay, this little chap on the right, this poor little kangaroo here, is dehydrated. So by definition should be under his weight expected for his developmental stage, but his head length will be the same. His body's trying to grow no matter what's happening to the rest of him. And it's almost, I know the orientation of this is wrong, but he's kind of got big head, little body, which is a sign of stunting. This little chap had only had a broken leg for 10 days, but you don't take animals to the vets, do you? Because they euthanize them. Had we seen him on the first day, different outcome. And of course, yes, we've got animals that are growing, so you need to match the weight and thus the body condition score to the stage. A little fatso lorikeet like this is going to have his big Buddha belly, isn't he, full of food that he's using literally as the organ to grow. And so he may not have quite the right body condition score compared to an adult. And he, at this point in time, I'm hoping is, well, 113 grams, he's probably about on track. But his appearance in terms of just feathering the head, just getting pins on the wings, the tails appearing literally allows you to slot him into the weight that he should be for his age. When we get to true emaciation, which is that 30%, and we will see animals at 50%, we are in real trouble, because at this point in time, the body has started to die. It has literally eaten itself. Now, let's remember, if we are going to destroy muscles, the kidneys have to filter it. So by its definition, we are now in kidney disease. If you don't feed the intestinal cells shrink. Now you've got less ability to absorb. If you're not absorbing food, the liver reduces in size. So and again, imagine that I'm going to give you 10 days to lose 50% of your weight. Are you going to go to work on the 11th day? Are you going to play 90 minutes of football? Are you going to fly from the Arctic? No. So you're in serious trouble at that stage. And I'm really going to use this example of the short-tailed shearwater. One of the comments made about the books this morning is, I've already got one, why have you got one another? I do small print runs to update information, because one of the challenges is that I actually pulled the textbook off the shelf, written by an excellent rehabilitator from a well-known large facility on the East Coast, and it says that you should essentially give the short-tailed shearwater a grain-based diet. So that's what sits in a textbook. That's a book that you might pick up. That's not correct. And so many people go, well, hang on, I'm a human nurse. I'll do what we do for humans. And suddenly we're getting these more high sugar foods, or we're getting high carb foods because we eat carbs as our source of energy. So therefore everyone must. No, need to be very specific about what they eat in the wild, and that becomes their recovery food, rather than us putting human requirements over the animal, okay, for when we deal with refeeding syndrome in them. So what have we got to do? Body is made up of water. It's made up of 70% water. Essentially, having body water is going to remove the waste, and that's my first desire to get out of there. I want every single one of those cells back paying attention and doing what they're meant to do, and that means I need to feed them water. Now, of course, in the water, I also want things like electrolytes. One of the things about refeeding syndrome that you will hear about is how essentially every electrolyte misbehaves. So we've got to put the salt back in. We've got to put the chloride, the potassium, the magnesium, the calcium back in. And very interestingly, so many of our electrolytes have exactly those things in them. We're starting to address what we need to do. So yes, subcut to start, and yes, oral. Feed the intestinal cells. If you can give them some electrolytes and some basic sugars in that first feed or so, we are starting to get them to turn back on and literally stand back up to intention and go, oh yeah, I'm meant to absorb some nutrients, aren't I? Let's get on with that. Don't give electrolytes with food. We still find this occurring throughout Australia. This makes no sense. Food has electrolytes in it. Food has salt. It has potassium in it. When you then essentially, if you like, this would be like me creating a soup for you today, and instead of water, putting Powerade in it. You kind of go, yeah, I got that, Anne, but I don't really need that. I can choose to drink the Powerade or not when I have that meal. We want to essentially create foods as foods, not as more electrolytes. We'll create what's called osmotic drag. We'll actually pull those electrolytes out of the body and make the problem worse. Don't do it. You've been told. And be complex. Well, look, you hear from my masters that I absolutely, my honours year, not as far as the masters yet, please no. Gordon will say no too. I'm a big fan of vitamins. And certainly we know in refeeding syndrome, in those emaciation states, that there's no intake of B. B comes with food, if you like. It isn't stored, it's water soluble. It's gone in 24 hours if you put it in. So of course we want the water solubles back in. Thiamine is low in emaciation, and B12, cobalamin, is needed by the bacteria in the gut to stay alive. So essentially they've been starved and they've got a role in processing food. I can extend from this to say, well, what about the other water-soluble vitamins? My favorite at the moment is vitamin C, because I just love it. I like to say it's everyone's big helper friend. It'll help you with the maths. It'll help you with the English. It'll help you shoot the ball. It's required by the immune system. It's required by the bones. It is actually used. It will go and play inside the gut. It will play inside fur. It does everything. And there's absolutely nothing in the literature about using it in refeeding syndrome in humans. Why is everyone picking on one sort of water-soluble vitamin and not the others? Maybe there is a role for vitamin C. And then, yes, I need you to correct the dehydration. For those who've done my training this before, you've seen this slide because I keep trotting it out. I do think my impression remains that we're good at rehydrating for day one. I need you to keep on going, and more to the point, in refeeding syndrome, to keep on going, that you very likely may be still having to put an extra fluid requirement in for day 4, 5, 6. And then we want to start to introduce some food. So we're not going to give 100% of the diet on day one to the thin animal. We've got to correct the hydration first. I want to see the peas and the poos out to know that that gut has been flipped back on and is ready to take some food. When I look at this, this is very much what happens for me for animals that come in. Animal gets dropped into the clinic sometime in the morning. It gets its x-ray under its anesthesia, and I've intentionally wanted it starved so it doesn't choke under the anesthesia. Underneath that anesthetic, it's getting its subcut fluids for the first time. About 4 hours later, once hopefully something's hit the floor, peas and poos, that's when I'm coming back in with either an electrolyte feed, and that's what I recommend vet clinics are doing before they farm out the animal at 5 or 6 o'clock at night. I may be doing my first feed for things like birds. I'm probably not going to do a first feed for a reptile. But then animal chuffs off home, and at about 8 o'clock, maybe it gets its first milk feed. Maybe it actually does get its crop feed for the evening. So can you see that on the day one, it never got me shoving food in until 4 in the morning. I looked after fluids first, and that's what's going to happen for pretty much all stage ones. When we talk about these truly emaciated animals, so now I'm talking about the animal who's a body condition score of 1 that's in real trouble, the introduction of food is going to happen over 3 days, that we're going to work from feeding 1/3 of the food on day 1 right up to 100% by day 3, unless you are more emaciated than that. There's a role for a couple of things here. There are pancreatic enzymes that may be of help. In fact, it wasn't Gordon, but it was Sam that was going, what about impact? And I was going, yeah, what about impact? That feeds intestinal cells. That's got a real role potentially in this. High in protein, just what a lot of bodies are going to need. Small volume going in, but packing a bit more of a punch. Now, this is an access to something that we have that the human field don't really have, do they? And maybe haven't thought to use. Probiotics, yes, suitable for the species, okay? Remember that big aggressive probiotic called lactobacillus is not found in marsupials, is not found in reptiles. So remains the one that we can access from human fields is really only suitable for birds. And yes, can they self-feed? What can they start to tell us? This is a little bit with what the plan ends up looking like with days. So maybe refeeding of our short-tailed shearwaters is going to end up taking a week plus to get there. Now we want to kind of get there fairly slowly and not race. How many of them are dying essentially because we've shifted those electrolytes and caused heart failure because we've said, you're starving, you must need a big feed. But they actually needed rehydration and a staged, planned approach to kind of get there. That, I think, will be the last of it. There are a bunch of references as well and more. Giving me 1 minute and 20 seconds for questions.